Okay guys, let's start. I'm super excited because this is my first live workshop and it's going to be about model binding. We're going to cover all the advanced scenarios which are typically difficult for developers. So we have quite a lot to cover, but first we need to start with the basics. The basics is the difference between a get and a post request in a web app and how the ASP.NET Core framework handles them. So let's just create a new project and start writing some code. One moment to lower down the volume of the good. Sorry about that. So I'm going to create a new repository in here. The repository is going to be called model binding playground, where we will be testing various different scenarios. I'm going to select model view controller because we are going to cover both API and form model binding. Creating the project, and I'm going to add some classes here. First, the student class. We're going to use the class as a sample. I'm going to add some properties. And later on, I'm going to add additional nested properties, arrays, collections, and so on, because these are going to be our advanced scenarios we're going to cover. I'm going to remove all the unnecessary code here, so let's just leave the index page. I'm going to create forms controller class so that we can see the difference between the get and post requests. First things first, I'm going to create action result, my get request, doesn't matter actually, and I'm going to return OK. First I need to inherit the base controller like this. So what is different between the get and the post request is that the post request is sending the data through the body of the HTTP request, and the get request is sending the data through the query string, and both are these are completely different in terms of how the default model binder works with all the data we're trying to send. So I'm going to create a folder, a forms folder, and then I'm going to add a view. The view is going to be my get request so that it works correctly. And I'm going to say that I want to return a view like this. Here I'm going to specify that the model is the student class I created earlier, and I'm going to create a form. The form will have an input type text. Let's start with ASP4 name. We're going to use an input for the name property of the student, and an input ASP4 the age property of the student. In order to submit the form, I would need an input type submit. Here I'm going to create an ASP controller, forms controller, and I'm going to create an action which will receive the date, get date for example. And I'm wanting the student to be automatically model bound by the ASP.NET Core framework. So I'm going to just return OK to see what kind of data we're passing through. Okay, so with the GET request, starting the app, and going to /forms /my get request should visualize our form. Okay, so if the method of the form is get sp action to get data, if the method of the form is get, all the data will be sent through a query string. I get request like this. Ivan 5, if we hit submit, we will see that everything is working. Apparently the ASP.NET Core action is returning the proper data here, but what is specific for the GET request is that the data is passed here in the URL as a query string. So essentially what the browser does for us is it finds all the inputs in the current form, gets the name properties, name attributes actually, and sends the data through these name attributes. Good. And the automatic model binder binds the student, so everything is working correctly. This is different for HTTP post, because when we have a post method and when we say the data is post like this, the data is sent not through the URL, but is sent through the body of the request. So going to forms my get request and sending the data, we can see the data if we go to the debugger tools, then network. When I write something here, we can see that again everything is working correctly for now, but the data is sent through the body, and the data is encoded in exactly the same way as it is encoded in the GET request, name and age here. What is important is that the content type header here should show that the data is in this format. This format x-www-form-URL encoded actually means that the browser or the client of the app, it doesn't matter whether it's a browser or not, sends the data in this particular format here, name and age, like a query string, but it's sent through the body of the request. And we can see that if I go to Postman and specify I want to send a post request to localhost /form/get data, if I specify the header to be content type application form URL encoded, this one here. And if I say that the body is in a completely raw form, like this, like the query string we showed earlier, we will see that it's still working. So it doesn't need to be a form. It needs to have the following format, and the request needs to have the proper content type. So if I hit send the request, we will see that the student is again model bind. So the important part here is that a GET request is sent through the URL, and the POST request is sent through the body of the request. Also, the body can be an application JSON, for example, but things get pretty different if we change the content type header to be application JSON. We're going to cover that in a minute, because the default model binder actually works differently with JSON and with form values. So that's the most important part of the requests, get and post, because with get requests, the model binder works in a different way. We will see in a minute that form fields and root data, for example, cannot be bound to a complex model types. Complex model type is essentially a class. If we have a class as a model here, it is a complex type. Primitive types or simple types are everything like ints, strings, and double. Essentially all the primitive types here in the .NET Core language. Good. Okay, so let's go to what kind of targets we may have in the model binding. In the model binding, we may have two kinds of targets. The first target is actually well known because people usually do it this way, and that's when our target is part of the actions arguments, for example, like here. But a more unknown approach is if we want to bind a property in our controller, we can also do it. It needs to be public, like this, with public getter and setter, but we need to provide the bind property attribute. So this is another way to bind models in your application. This is useful if you have the same model throughout all the actions in the controller, but usually people define the arguments because it's easier to access what's going on. Good. With that covered, I would like to show you the controllers and the API controllers, because there's a huge difference between them, especially in model binding and data validation. By default, we may inherit our controllers from controller class, but we may inherit from the controller base class, which doesn't support views, and essentially it supports a REST API interface. You can return status codes from here. For example, OK, not found, files, redirects, and so on. And if you want to return views, you need to inherit from the controller class. But I'm going to create another one. If I create a class, REST controller, which will be our API controller, like this one, API controller base, like this. We need to mark this controller class as API controller, and the model binding starts working a little bit differently. We're going to cover when it works correctly or as expected and when not. The first most important part is that if you say student like this. And if you want to create an ajax request, or if you want to create, if you have a client app which needs to call this action without a form, without an HTML, essentially with JSON, if I go here and try to make a post request, and if I specify that the data is JSON, and if I edit here the body of the request to be an JSON instead of the form format, and if I hit send, I will see nothing because my app is not started. But if I hit send, I will see that the object is not model bound automatically as I expected. And we can see that if I do the same with the REST controller, which is marked as an API controller, I don't need that, we will see that this action will start working automatically. So there's a difference. Sorry about that. I need to specify a route here. So I'm going to say route REST. So if I try to make a post request to /REST with the same JSON data, so I need to just call REST and send the data, I will see that now it's automatically model bound. So there's a bit of a difference between the normal controller, which works with views and which works with form data, and the controllers which are API controllers and which work with JSON objects directly. So essentially in this controller we are not working with views, with forms and all that stuff. So that's one of the differences. Other differences which we have, I mentioned here, we're going to cover them in a minute. Besides the targets, which are essentially the objects we want to create with our model binding requests, there is also a source in terms of the model binding terminology. The sources are essentially all these 5 sources. So our object in the action can be retrieved from one of these places. The first one is form fields. That's exactly the same as we saw it here, with a form in the view, or if we send a request which has a body like this with the appropriate header about the URL encoded form. This is the first source which ASP.NET Core is looking for when trying to bind your requests. So I've ordered here all the sources in the order in which the ASP.NET Core framework will try to bind your properties. So it will first look in the form fields, then it will look in the body fields, the body of the request. Then it will look in root data, then in query strings, and finally it will see whether a file is being uploaded with the current request. So let's start with the form fields. We already saw that they are working correctly with the normal controller, and they are the preferred way to bind models, because we saw already that it doesn't work if we send a JSON property here. It simply doesn't work. How does it work behind the scenes? Because the ASP4 attribute is essentially a tag helper coming from ASP.NET Core, and it's not part of the final HTML produced. So if I want to do this in a completely clean HTML, I would need to write the name property by myself. I will need to write the correct property I want to be bound in this student class. So if I want to do the same with the number, I can specify name equals age. So this name attribute is actually the one thing that is important to do all the magic in the model binding. So we will see that if I run this, it will still work and it will still bind our form. So if I go here and say forms slash my get request and enter something, everything is still working correctly. So the ASP-4 attribute is here to help me with IntelliSense. ASP4 equals, and I am having an IntelliSense here, but behind the scenes it's generating the following HTML. This is with the forms, and the forms are like a query string by default. Sometimes the ASP.NET Core framework cannot recognize from where to bind the data, so you may need to help him. You may specify from where the data should come from. So if I want the data to come from the form, I can specify it with the attribute. I can specify from form. In this particular action, this is not required because it's the default behavior. I can also specify from form on different properties. So I can bind model types like this. Give me the name from the form, but give me the age from a query. We will see the query in a minute. That's pretty much everything we need to know about the form fields for simple types when we don't have any nesting involved, when we don't have any collections involved, but I'm going to cover them later in this workshop. Second thing is the body. The body is only bound by default when we have an API controller. We already saw that, but how to do it if we want to have a normal controller with views and such, but we want to make an ajax request and want to send an JSON request and not a form one. In order to make it work in a normal controller, we need to help the model binder, and we need to specify that this student class should be bound from the body. This is an attribute coming from the ASP.NET Core framework. And with this attribute here, the request we did earlier with the name and age as a JSON property and the proper content type. The content type is important because the content type is how the model binders decide to parse the data. And if we don't send the content type here, specifying that this body is a JSON object, it won't work. So these two parts are important. So we can see that now the model binder is working correctly because we specified the from body attribute. This is the default behavior and it's the expected behavior. In controllers, complex type again is a class essentially, which we created. Complex types are bound through the form fields. In API controllers, like this one here, complex types don't need the from body attribute because that's the default behavior. So that's a key difference. Okay, next. The next thing is root data. Root data is coming from parameters specified in a route. Parameters in a route are defined in the startup class, usually, or they can be defined on an attribute. If I say that this route here expects an ID as a parameter needs to be surrounded by curly brackets. This is how the ASP.NET Core framework recognizes parameters. So adding a question mark here makes the parameter not required. I can do the following. I can say I want to have a name and I want to have an age, like this. Uh, this is not preferable. I'm just showing you here how you can use the route system for model binding, but usually you don't want to bind the student property, like here, from routes. Usually this comes from a form, but sometimes it's useful to bind properties from the route, so I'm going to show you. If I go here in the forms controller, and if I say, okay, I want the get request to return an OK result with the student, like this, student, and if I say int ID, let's run that. I'm going to say I want an ID and I want a student. I'm going to return both to see whether this is working correctly. This is a normal controller, still a normal controller, with views and all that goodies. Forms / my get request. If I hit it like this, the model binder does not recognize how to bind everything involved. It's not working correctly because it has, oh, one moment. It's not working in API controllers. I didn't provide parameters. My mistake, sorry. So /forms my get request. Then I can provide the arguments here in the order I defined them in the URL. So after the action, everything I specify is the ID, then the name, and then the age, because this is the way I ordered the parameters here. And the model binder will try to match these parameter names here, name and age, to the parameters here. So, for example, the ID will be bound from this parameter, and the student will be bound from these two. So if the name here, the age, for example, is the same as the student age property, it will try to bound this. So if I try to hit a URL like this one, we can see that it's now working. And it's working because it's matching the names of the parameters here with the parameters here. So if the student class didn't have the name but had, for example, full name property, the route will not work because here I said that it's name and not full name. This is how the model binder tries to find everything. We can see that the full name is not bound, but the age is working and the ID is working too. So if I want to make this work, I can say that this parameter is full name, but I can also say that this parameter is name. If the names match, it will be fine. It will start working. The same is not working with an API controller. The API controller is essentially not. The API controller is not bounding everything that is complex type by design. So this is a key difference too. If I go to the REST controller and if I say, okay, I want to have a route which has the same URL like this one, this should work. /rest /ivan /5 should work. If I hit it like this, the API controller by design does not bind name and age properties when we have a complex models. So I hit a problem, method not allowed. Yeah, I have an HTTP post that's, let's use Postman to make the post request. I'm going to say Ivan 5. And if I hit that, I can see that, oh, apparently, let me try something else. Route, I don't need the route. It was not working earlier when I prepared the workshop. Funny stuff. Let me see if I say name equals Ivan and age equals 5. What will happen? Still working. That's interesting. Let me try one more time. Oh, yeah. Another key difference. Let me do it like this. I'm going to change the method to an HTTP get one, and I'm going to provide the data as a query string. It's a post request, this is why it's working. So I need to call /rest/Ivan/ I'm going to send it as a query string. And we can see that there is an unsupported media type status code like this one. I will try with a route having parameters like this one. I'm going to run it again. I'm going to send REST Ivan 5 unsupported media type again. Let's try it with Postman because we are currently seeing that it's not working. So let's go to Postman and try to make a GET request to this. I'm going to send that and I'm going to see that everything is currently working correctly. So if I don't specify the header application JSON, oh, wait a minute. I have a body here. Let's restart it. I'm going to hit that and I'm again seeing a problem. The input does not contain any JSON token. So essentially in API controllers on GET request, this is not working correctly. I can remove the content type and I can send the request. I'm going to see an unsupported media type. If I try to send an empty object like this, I will see that it's not model bound. So by design in API controllers on GET methods, routes and query strings are not working for complex types. This is by design. So in order to make this work, if I want to get the data from here, I have two options. The first option is to use primitive types like this and then create the student by myself. Name equals name, age equals age. Let's use the ID. So let's run that and see whether the same URL will work. So I'm hitting this and wait a minute. I need to say Ivan 5 in order to get the route data. Let's run it, and I can see that now it's working because I have the route, and it was not working with query strings because they're later in the model binding order. The important part here is that the root data is before query strings, so it's working correctly. Okay, so the name and the ID is bound, but this is apparently not a cool way if I have a lot of properties. So what I need to do is I need to say if I want to have a student here like this, what I can do is I can say from a route like this. If I say from route in an API controller in a GET request, the route will start working correctly. So let's run it. Let's send the same request and we will see that the student is working correctly. Ivan is gotten from here. So to bind complex model types in a GET request, you need to specify from route or from query for that matter. It doesn't matter. Okay, I'm going to remove the route attribute. In a summary, the controller class, the base controller, the normal class with the views, will bind complex types from routes and query strings too. But in API controllers, that's not working. And that's important because people don't understand usually the difference between these two. Why this is by design? It's because the API controller is designed for RESTful services, and in RESTful services you usually don't want to send huge objects through the query strings or through the routes. Usually you send them through the JSON body. This is why by design complex types are bound through the body. Okay, let's move to query strings. Query strings are the same. In an API controller, the query string will not bound complex model types. Let's try it with... First, let's try it in an HTTP GET like this one, my GET request. If I run the app, go to /forms /my get request /1 and then I provide name Ivan and age 5, exactly what the student is expecting. And if I hit that, I will see that the model binding is working correctly. But if I go to Postman and try to do the same here to bind the student from a query string, if I send a get request to REST with a query string name Ivan and age 5 and send that, I will see that it's not working correctly. The input does not contain any JSON token. If I add an empty body, I will see that the name and the age properties are not bound, even though I'm sending a query string. To make it work with the query string, I will need to provide from query like this. So I'm sending the data here and it's now working correctly. So I need to help the model binder to tell him I need the data from the query string in order to make it work. Let's do it with an HTTP post request. If I remove the from query, it will not work again because it will search for the student in the JSON body, which I'm not providing currently. With an HTTP post, if I make the post request like this, I will see that it's still working. You can mix these attributes however you like. You can go to the student and say, I want the name property to come from the query and the route property to the age property to come from the route. This is absolutely possible. You can even specify the name of the model here, but uh, that's not that important. So if I go to the REST controller and say that the route here is essentially providing me with the age property, this will be bounded, because if I say the query and the route here, it will mix all the different values and it will create the student like this. You can also use another attribute which is called from header. So I'm going to add another property and I'm going to say from header like this, and I'm going to say that the header name is my custom header. You can mix that too, so you can bound from queries, routes and headers at the same time if you think that's suitable for your app. Usually it's not that mixed. Usually you bound properties from a single place, but sometimes you may send an additional header. So if I go to the here and make a post request to the /rest/some age, because I said that the age should come from a route. Then if I add a query name equals some name like this, and if I add a header, my custom header with some value, and if I hit that, I will see something's not right, and that's not right because I still need to say that to the main class here, because, or from route for that matter, because by default it will try to bind it from the JSON body. So I need to override that behavior. So let's go and try to do the same. We will see that the name and the age is bound. Let's see what's wrong with the header. I believe I made a mistake in the name, so it needs to be this one. So let's run it and see that now it's model bound. So this is key when using different kinds of objects with complex objects with the API controller. We need to specify where the data is coming from, because by default it's coming from the request body. Let's remove this. There's another, because from query, form, header, route and body should be self-explanatory, but there's another from services. You may inject and model bind properties coming from the registered services. So for example, if I have an iData service interface, I can inject it in the attribute here directly. So the from services is useful when you want to inject a service in your controller, but don't want to inject it through the constructor, but through the method directly. Okay, so I'm going to cover files later, so I'm going to skip them for now. What is important with the model binding is that model state is ignored on empty values. What I mean by that is, if I try to make if model state is valid, return bad request like this one. And if I try to post empty values for the student, I need to do it through the body currently. I'm going to call the post method without the headers and all that, and with an empty body. I will see that the age is the default value, another name knows, but the model state is valid. So I'm not going to receive a bad request here, and that's important. The default model state does not consider empty values as required. So how to fix that? To fix that, you have a bind required property, this one, which makes the model state invalid when this name property is missing. You may specify it here too. Let's see what's the error. So I'm hitting the same thing, and I will see that the name is invalid, but for some reason it's still giving me no bad requests. Let me put it on the student class. It's still true. That's strange. It should work. I'm going to check that out because it's strange how it's not working. There is also bind property, which allows you to include what to bind. For example, if I want to say bind, and I can say I want to include only name and age. I'm going to check the bind required, why it's not working, because it should be working. So the bind property specified like this, bind name and age, this means that only the name and age will be bound automatically. The another should not be bound. This is useful when you want to exclude something. You can also specify it like this. Bind never. This should tell the model binder to never bind the another property here. Let me check the let me check the my get request. I'm going to add bind required here, but this should work if I remove the input. This should work, but for some reason it's not working. I'm going to say forms slash my get request h5 submit. It's still not showing any problems. Let me check it again. So if I go to the immediate window, debug windows, where is that? So if I say this model state is valid, it shows me false. So it's working here in the forms controller. For some reason it's not working in the REST controller, and I'm suspicious that bind required is not working currently because they changed the JSON parser. The JSON parser since 3.0 is no longer no longer Newtonsoft JSON. It's system text JSON, a new library, and it still does not support many things. For example, it does not support dictionary bounding, and apparently it may not support the bind required. Let's see. Cannot see any particular reason, but maybe that's the reason. The JSON parser is new and still does not support everything out of the box. So maybe that's the problem. It's not working correctly in the REST app. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to research that and see what's going on. Let's continue with everything else. Personally, I never use the bind attributes because it allows you to have a leaky abstraction. Usually it's better to define a model, you know that, a student request model, for example, and list all the properties you want to have included in the model binding. For example, if I don't want to have the another, this student request model will have only name and age. This will save me from future problems if I use the bind properties. Because imagine the following. If I say bind and if I say name and age here like this, and then everything is working correctly, the another property is not automatically model bound, everything is fine. But then some developer comes to the class and adds something secret, so adds another property that should be hidden in the student, but that developer does not know that this student class is used here as a model binded class. He may forget to add the another secret, the something secret here, because there is no compile time checking to tell you that you need to add it here. And when you have a huge solution with thousands of actions, there's certainly a huge possibility that the developer will forget to put the something secret here. So that's important, and it's better to use different classes for the model bound objects, because otherwise this is a problem. Because we are giving here magic strings. Also, what will happen if we decide to change the age to birth years, which is a stupid name, but what will happen if we change it? We need to change it here too. And that's essentially not that great. Of course, what we can do is use the name of operator and say student age like this, but this bind attribute here will become a lot longer when we want to bind more complex objects. So the preferable way is to never use bind. You don't need it essentially. It's a better way to use different classes for your model binding scenarios, which suit the purpose of having something coming from the external request. Otherwise, people may forget that they need to specify the properties here. They may forget to exclude the property. Something secret like this, you need to say bind never, and so on and so on. So these attributes are here, but I prefer not to use them. So let's make a quick break of 5 minutes, and we're going to continue with nested properties, collections, and files. Of course, we're going to cover custom model binders too. Thank you for watching so far. I hope that it's interesting. I'm trying to cover all the small details in the model binding, because usually people understand the model binding overall, how it works, but they don't understand that there's a difference between the controllers, the different parts of the requests you can use to build your models, and so on. So, okay, let's have a 5-minute break, and we're going to continue with nested objects, collections, and files. So guys, let's return to the workshop. I've researched the bind required attribute, and it's essentially a design problem with the ASP.NET Core framework. It's exactly the same thing I mentioned. By default, when we have a complex type, it will be deserialized from the JSON, and the JSON will set these to no, but then the validation cannot. Uh, so the important part is that validation comes after the JSON deserialization, and if we don't send an age property in our JSON, the model binder will leave a default value of 0, and then the validation will not be able to determine whether the 0 is an actual user input or essentially it's not. So with the REST controller, the bind required will not work. It will work on forms controller like we saw that it's working here, but on the REST controller it will not. If we want to use a validation, we can say JSON ignore like this one. This is essentially the like bind never, and if we're using Newtonsoft JSON, Newtonsoft JSON has JSON required, so we can use that, but bind required will not work in JSON bodies. Okay, of course you can override that default behavior with some custom logic, but out of the box it's not working. Okay, let's continue with nested properties. Nested properties with models. I'm going to add a course class, and I'm going to say that the course is having a topic. And then I'm going to add an author class. Public string phone name. The author of the course, for example. I'm going to say that the course has an author, and the student will have a course for now. Like this. So how to bind nested properties? With JSON bodies, that's essentially easy. If we go to the post, we just need to have a nested object. Like this. And we can specify the topic here. For example, JavaScript. That's easy. With JSON bodies, it's essentially easy to send data because you just specify a nested object, a nested array, or whatever you like, and it will be bound. But what about forms? Forms are a little bit different. So in order to mark something that is nested, for example, course, and specify ASP4, it's also easy, but sometimes you need to specify it manually. So if I say I want to add course.topic, then if I want to say author and say input ASP4 course.author.fullname, that will work out of the box. So let's see what kind of HTML is generated for the nested property, because sometimes we need to manually add an input so that it will work with the default model binding, and we don't have access to ASP-4 tag helper. So forms my get request, we will see that there's a form here. If I say Ivan 5, course topic is Java, author George. If we submit that, we will see that the nested properties are working correctly. Everything is bound. What is generated behind the scenes is actually the dot specifies that we have a nested object. So if I write name course.author.fullname, nested binding will work. So if I want to add that dynamically with JavaScript, for example, I can specify, okay, I want to have text, and the name should be the nested property, which is course, like here, and then the nested property of that property. So if I say course.topic, and if I say type equals text, then name equals course.author.fullname, that will continue to work. So nested properties and nested objects essentially use the dot syntax, and this is how the model binder gets all these values from the nested properties. So if we run that and say OK for my get request, we'll write something here, we will see that it will still work. If I say that I want to have that from an HTTP GET request from query, like this, I need to provide the query string with the same dot syntax. So essentially I need to make a GET request to swash form swash get data, and I need to say name equals Ivan and age equals 5, and course dot, and here course dot topic equals JavaScript, and I will see that it's again bounded. So if I use the dot syntax, I can bind nested properties of nested objects. That's the important part with the nested properties. Let's see collections now, and let's see collections with nested objects, because typically in a normal web app we have multiple objects in multiple collections and so on. So with collections, first we may have a query string with primitive types. For example, if I have HTTP GET public iAction result query, and if I want to bind this collection from a query string, I need to specify the collection syntax, which is /form/ query, and then I need to say data from 0 equals 10 and data from 1 equals 20, and so on. So the data here is the same name as the collection here. Then the indexes should be provided like this, and you should use valid indexes. So if I hit that, I will see that an array is returned. So essentially the binding was successful. So with query strings, I can do the following syntax. You can try this syntax too. It's working correctly. because there is only one collection here. But if I want to bind multiple collections, I need to provide the previous syntax where I specified the data. So the string here should be data like this, and data and queries from 0 equals some query, and queries from 1 equals another query. So these two will be bound to this property data, and these two will be bound to the queries. This is with query strings. With query strings, it's a little bit it's easy to do that. But what happens when we have a form? Also, when we have a JSON, it's also easy to pass an array with objects, and what we need to have here is objects which has the same property names. So if we send the following array, and if the model behind that is having a list of courses like this, this model binding will work. With JSON objects, it's a little bit easier. If we follow the same scheme, if we follow the same model structure, we won't have any problem. But with the forms, it's a little bit trickier, because how to generate multiple courses here? The easiest way, but that's not always possible, is to use a for loop. If you use a for loop and say, I want to have 3 courses, you may say something like that. Text, then, no need for text. ASP4, you may say courses from I dot topic like this, and then the author will be courses from I author full name. This will work and this will be fine, but it's not always possible to put a for loop, because usually when we have to bind multiple properties, a collection of objects, we don't know how many objects we need, but I'm going to show that in a minute. So going to /forms, my get request, I can see that I can show multiple courses and authors here. And if I say some age and some course, some author, like this, and where's the submit button? I forgot it. So let's go to forms, my get request, 5, course 1, 2, and 3, and author 1, 2, and 3. Hit submit, and we will see that everything is bound correctly. Topic, course 1, author, full name, author, and so on. The data is bound correctly. So if we use a for loop here, it's easy. That's okay. But typically it's not that simple, because we don't know exactly how many we need to add here. Uh, let's see what kind of HTML is produced. If we take a look, we will see that the HTML produced is using indexes like this. So for each input, there is an index. So if I try to imitate that behavior and I cannot use, for example, a for loop, or I don't want to use an ASP-4 tag helper, what I can do is I can say, okay, let's make this name, put 0. Let's make this name too, put 0 here. And for every different topic I want to create, I can give a different number like this. So this will still work even though I'm not using ASP-4. Let's restart the app to see that it's working. Keep in mind that you don't need to specify the properties to be with Pascal case. You can use camel case as well. Okay, let's hit again the forms, my get request, and try it again. If we submit, we will see that it's still working even though we're not using for loops. So this is working, and we can use that convention to create dynamic forms by knowing how to use these indexes. Dynamic forms can be created by JavaScript, so we need a little bit of jQuery or any other JavaScript knowledge, but you can see how we can match nested properties like this one with collections. It doesn't matter as long as we're using the dot syntax for nested properties and indexes for collections. ASP.NET Core will work, and it will model bind even nested collections in nested collections in nested collections. It doesn't matter as long as we're providing the indexes in the correct order. So how to make this form dynamic? I'm going to say input type button. I'm going to add an add course tag, and I'm going to say add course like this. Then I'm going to add a container, courses container with that ID, and I'm going to say section scripts, because here I can use jQuery in this section scripts in a script tag. So what I want to do is I want to create dynamic inputs when I click this button, and I want to add them in the courses container. That's the important part here. So if I follow the convention with the name attributes, I will be completely fine. So let's create a JavaScript scope, and let's first get the courses container. Then I want to attach a click event to this button. So I need to say click. Of course, you can do that with Angular, with whatever you like. It doesn't matter. As long as you follow the conventions of the input type names, this is the important part. It will still work with every other Quant framework. So I'm going to say prevent default here so that the form is not submitted when I click the button. And then I'm going to start creating the inputs. I'm going to create a div, and I'm going to append in the div the input type name and input type text. My mistake. And the name property should be the one we talked about. So I need to say, okay, I want to have courses with some ID here, dot topic. And I want that to be appended to the container. I want the same thing for the author.full name. So essentially I'm adding inputs here. But what is missing? I miss the indexer. So what I need to do here is I need to say courses, course inputs equals 0. And I need to say, okay, use course inputs here, and then append, increment the course inputs variable. That's the important part. So as long as I'm following the convention of using the square brackets for collections and dots for nested objects, everything should be fine. And I'm currently increasing every input which is added here. So let's restart the app and see how the nested objects should work correctly. So let's go to the forms my get request. If I hit add course, I will see that an input is added. And what's important, it's important to have the proper names and indexers here. And if we take a look, we have the proper indexes. So everything should work as expected, but this time I'm having a dynamic form. So if I say 5 and I add it like this, I can even add another one. I can add as many courses as I like, and if I hit submit, I will see that it's still working and everything is model bound correctly, no matter the amount of courses I'm adding. Here it is. So that's the tricky part about collections when you have when you need to use dynamic forms. But with a simple JavaScript, I added different types of input types which follow the model binding convention, and that will work. You can use the same technique for nested collections in nested collections, and that will be completely fine as long as the index here is correct. It's trickier to make a remove button next to this, but because you need to go and fix these indexes, but that's more of a JavaScript problem and not the model binding problem. If you're following the conventions of the square brackets, everything will be fine. Okay, so I showed you for loops, manual collections, query strings with complex types, dynamic collections. Good. Now let's go to files. In order to use files in a form, for example, I'm going to add a new property here which will bind the file. If I say iForm file, which is the default, for example, image of the student, which is the default way to bind files from a request. If I say iForm file image, I can easily add and say input ASP4 equals image. That's the easiest way. If I want to make it manually without ASP4, because sometimes it's necessary, I just need to say input type file. But this will not work out of the box. Forgot the name property. Name equals image because that's the property of the file here. If I run that, go to the forms my get request, I have a file now. I'm going to put a breakpoint here so that we can analyze what's going on. I'm going to say Ivan H5. I'm going to choose some file, this one, and I'm going to hit submit. Hitting this, I'm going to have an image of no. It's not working. In order to bind files, you need to specify a special form, which is multi-part form. This multi-part form allows you to bind files and have multiple files per form. So what I need to do is just I need to say enctype multipart slash form dash data. If you cannot remember that because it's a little bit specific, you can also always search for form enctype multipart form data and it will be found on Google. So if you just write form enctype and it will show you the correct attribute. So I'm going to run that. And I'm going to go to the forms my get request. I'm going to fill this. I'm going to choose a file, for example this one, and I'm going to hit submit. There's something wrong here. HTTP post get data student iForm file image. iForm file image. So I can see now that the image is bound. I have the file name, the length, the image, everything is working correctly here. So to bind a file, the important part is to have the enctype multipart form data. That's the important part. And if you want to have multiple files, for example, if you want to have an enumerable of iForm file images, you can do that by just saying the name is images and the multiple attributes should be set like this. This will allow you to bind multiple files at the same time. You can also bind multiple files with different inputs. So choosing this, saying two files at the same time and hitting submit, I'll see that I have both files here. Now if I can do whatever I like with the file, there's a stream available here. I can copy it. Okay. For each image I can say image copy to, and I can copy it to a file. For example, file dot file dot what's wrong with you? It's seeing the action because the base controller has a file method and it's seeing it. But I can use the namespace alias to name the file as system file, and I can specify create, for example. And what I can do is I can say image.copy to, and I can specify this created file. And I need to provide a path to the file. So you can also use a stream, a memory stream, save it to the database, it doesn't matter. You have the stream from the file here. So this is how you bind multiple files. Of course, you can bind two files. For example, one is image and another is document, something like that. You can just say that you have an image and a document like this. And both files will be bound automatically. Good, that's pretty much everything about the files. It's not working out of the box if you don't specify the multi-part form data. That's the important part here. Otherwise, everything should be completely fine. Good, removing files. And finally, because we mentioned almost everything about model binding, the most difficult parts are collection binding and nested objects binding. So you should remember that the syntax is this index. For example, if you have courses with multiple authors, what you need to do is you can give it like this, and this one, and this one. And then you can do the same thing for the other course. Essentially, that will create a course with 3 authors in it, and it will bind the full name from there. It will create another course with three other authors in there, and it will add the full name to them. So this is how you deal with nested objects and nested collections. That's the correct way. And you can manipulate that with your JavaScript client, no matter jQuery, Vue.js, or Angular, React, whatever. It will still work. So let's create a custom model binder and we will be done. So I'm going to add infrastructure folder. In the folder, I'm going to add model binders. For example, I would like to bind the student without the default logic, because the default model binders work in maybe 95% of the scenarios. So you may not need to create a custom model binder, but there are situations where it will be easier for you if you just create a model binder. So I'm going to add a class student model binder. In order to use that, I need to implement iModelBinder interface, and all the information is here. So in this model binding context class, you have everything you need to know about the request. So what I can do here is I can say, okay, give me the request binding context http context.request, like this. Then I can say if request has form content type or doesn't have a form content type, then I don't want to bind this request. So essentially, I can say return that everything is fine because I cannot model bind this because I don't have a form. I want this model binder to work only on forms. Of course, you can make it work only on bodies or whatever. You decide the logic here. So you can specify whatever you like. But if in my current scenario, I'm saying that if I don't have a form, I don't want to bind the object. So if I want to bind student from a JSON body, I'm not going to use this model binder. It will return like this. But if I want to have a normal form action, then I need to use the new model binder, the custom model binder. Let me just return the student like this. And yeah, okay. So what I can do is I can say var form equals request.form. Get the data from the form. You have everything here. You have the query string, you have the headers, you have pretty much everything in the request. The body as a stream, you can do whatever you like with the raw form of the request. Then I will say const custom name equals custom name. Then I can say if form contains key custom name, return task complete task if it doesn't contain it. Otherwise, I'm going to say var name equals form from custom name. So get the name property from this field here. This field will be in my form and it will not be name, but it will be custom name like this. I'm going to remove the scripts and I'm going to remove that too. So my name will be custom name and my model binder will try to get that custom name, and if it exists, it will create the student for me. So what I can do, let's add h2 custom h, and I can say const string custom h. And if the form doesn't have the custom name or the form doesn't have the custom age, return. That's it. So we will model bind our student only if these two fields are present. Then I'm going to say var age equals form custom age. Now what I need to do is I just need to create the object manually, new student. I can say name equals name, age equals age. Of course, I need to parse the data, so the logic should be something like if int.tryParse form custom age out age. If you cannot parse the age as a number, then again return that this model binder cannot work. Otherwise, create the student object. And what I need to say is I need to say binding context dot result equals the student object. Yeah, I need to use model binding result dot success or dot failure. That's the syntax here. So finally I'm returning that everything is completed. I can also use async await so that I don't need to write all these completed tasks like this. But this is the logic I'm having, and you can do any kind of model binders, custom model binders. You can get an ID. For example, you can say request dot root values ID. This will return you the ID from the route, and you can say okay, var ID equals that, and then you can say var student equals this dot student service dot find by ID. Of course, you need to inject the iStudent service like you normally inject services, but that's the important part. You can fetch the student from the database. You can bind it with custom fields. You can do whatever you like. You have the logic here. So you can get the data from the database and pass it directly in the actions. That's the whole idea here. So you can do database calling, you can do custom binding, you can do whatever you like. The logic is yours to write. Because I don't have await methods, I'm going to return the task completed task. But if you have, it's completely okay. Okay, so I have the student model binder, but how to make it work? By default, I can do the following. I can go here and I can say model binder is type of student model binder. This will make the ASP.NET Core Framework use this model binder every time I try to bind a student, for example, in the form here. And because I changed the names of the inputs to be custom name and custom age, the form data will be sent with custom name and custom age, like here. So if I write something and hit submit, I will see that the custom model binder hits in, and this logic is now executed. It tries to find the custom name and custom age, but the form, of course, has them. Custom age Ivan, custom age 5. Then it tries to parse the student, and everything is working correctly, so then this student is passed. We can see that we have an age 5 and name Ivan working correctly with my custom model binder written here. But sometimes you don't want to have a model binder for the students in your application. You can do the following too. You can add the model binder on an parameter. So essentially this means that on this particular action, this student will be bound by this model binder, but in all other actions, for example this one, it will be bound by the default convention. So this is the way to write custom model binders. And if you don't want to use attributes, you can also add an application-wide convention, which is student model binder provider. You can create a provider, model binder provider, like this one, and you can say essentially this class allows you to choose a model binder depending on your custom logic. So I can say if this metadata model type equals type of student, if the model I need to bind is type of student, return new student model binder. Otherwise, return no. This is the way to make students be bound with your custom model binder everywhere, because otherwise you need to specify attributes either here or here. But if you want to make it available everywhere in your app, you need to create a provider and specify when to use that custom model binder. And the logic is simple. If we have a model type which is student, use the student model binder. And how to register that provider? It is done in the startup class. You go to add controllers and say options, model binder providers, insert new student model binder provider. This is important to use insert 0, because if you just go add like this model binder will be the last in the order. So essentially it will hit after the form, the body, the root data, the query string, and the files model binders, which will mean that, for example, the body model binder may try to parse the student before your custom model binder, and it will not work. So to make sure it's working correctly, you can insert it to be first before all other model binders. And that's the way to guarantee that this student model binder provider will work with every student before the default implementation. Okay, so if you want to inject services and don't have access to them here, what you can do is you can use binding context.http context request services get service student service. This will give you the services in the HTTP in the current request. So if you cannot use a constructor injection, you can use that. So okay, I registered the custom model binder provider, and that should make all my student boundings work correctly when I have a form, because my logic checks for a form. But now if I go to the forms my get request and I hit Ivan 5 submit, I will see that it's working correctly. It binds successfully name and age. And pretty much that's it, guys. You now know everything about model binding in ASP.NET Core. The most important parts is the API controller is different from the controller, and in the API controller you may need to help the model binder by specifying from query or from route or from body or something like that. Also, that the model binding ignores the model state validation, ignores empty values, so that's also important. And the nested properties, which are used with the dot syntax, and the nested collections, which are used with the square bracket syntax. We showed that in order to bind files you need a specific enc type, and we showed custom model binders. That's pretty much it for this workshop, so if you don't have any questions, we may finish it. It's important to know that if you want to ask a question about model binding, you may use the Coded Up group. It's on Patreon, so you may join it if you haven't already. But any question you may have with the ASP.NET Core model binding, you may write it there. Okay, so let's stop the video and